In this Gigabyte motherboard, I have a Threadripper 7970X, which is the brand new 32-core Zen 4 Threadripper for which we've been waiting absolutely ages. We have the processor installed in a Gigabyte TRX50 Aero D motherboard, and to support the processor we have 4 modules of Kingston Renegade Pro RDIMM memory. So it's DDR5, it's registered, and it's rated for 5600 mega transfers at AMD Expo. Curiously enough, it actually runs at 6000 mega transfers when you enable Expo, and that was quite unexpected. If we remove this tool-free SSD cover, we have 2 M.2 SSDs installed. I'm going to reverse the board because we want the logos the correct way up. The one is a Kingston Renegade M.2, which is PCI Express Gen 4, 4 terabytes in capacity. The other is this Crucial T700 Pro 1 terabyte, which is PCI Express Gen 5. The headline news for Threadripper 7000 is that it supports PCI Express Gen 5 storage, DDR5 memory, and you get a whole heap of cores. The regular Threadrippers up to 64 cores, Threadripper Pro 7000 up to 96 cores. The thing is that AMD has launched Threadripper 7000 and you'll have no difficulty buying PCI Express Gen 5 storage or the correct DDR5 RDIMM memory required for this new platform. However, you'll find that processors are in short supply, and the same is true of motherboards, and if you fancy buying a Pro processor or indeed a Pro motherboard, you'll definitely have some difficulty. We have a sample that is a mere 32 cores. That is less than this 64 core Threadripper 3990X that we reviewed absolutely ages ago, and indeed the Threadripper 5000 Pros that we reviewed a while back. Today I am not reviewing this new Threadripper. I have, however, given it an outing along with its brethren, and I've also looked back on our recent reviews of other models of Threadripper that I don't have here. Instead, in the new year, I'm going to receive a workstation PC from Scan, and they're going to send it along with a number of processors so I can swap them out, and hopefully I'll be able to try out 32, 64 and 96 core processors in the same system. That's going to be in the new year. For now, we're going to have a quick retrospective. We're going to rewind all the way back to Threadripper 1950X back in 2017. And then we're going to look at each of the generations of Threadripper so we can understand why it matters and why this new Threadripper 7000 is such an enormous deal. Let's begin by casting our minds back all the way to 2014. And we have to remind ourselves that Intel invented the high-end desktop market, or HEDT, by repurposing low-end Xeon processors. In late 2014, we were debating the merits of an 8-core processor at £440 against a 6-core at £300. We considered these to be rather expensive. But remember, a desktop processor was typically 4 cores or even 2 cores. Moving on to the middle of 2016, we had the Core i7-6950X with 10 cores and a price tag of $999. It was clear that PC enthusiasts were paying through the nose, so in early 2017 the arrival of Zen with the Ryzen 7 1800X, 8 cores for £320, was an absolute breath of fresh air. Soon after that, AMD moved the goalposts completely by launching the original Threadripper. And you can see that AMD was comparing Ryzen 7 against both Intel desktop parts and also some of their high-end desktop parts. By contrast, Threadripper was up against the highest of high-end desktop parts, and it was coming in considerably cheaper. 3 models, the 16-core 1950X at $999, the 12-core 1920X at $799, and the 8-core 1900X at $549. That last one's a bit of an oddball, but the idea was it was like a desktop part, but with much more I/O. And here we can see the layout of Threadripper. It's essentially 2 Ryzens put together, which means we can double up the I/O, double up memory support, double up everything. As a consequence, Threadripper supports a huge amount of PCI Express connectivity. You can have dual graphics cards with full support, plus M.2 SSDs, or you can have multiple graphics cards with multiple storage, or you can go for a huge amount of graphics cards, each with limited bandwidth. The specifications of each of the Threadrippers is impressive. Starting with the 1900X, we have decent clock speeds, a huge amount of PCI Express, and quad-channel DDR4. As we move up through the range to the 1920X, the clock speeds drop slightly, but we gain on cores. And up at the top end, the 1950X, 16 cores, still has decent clock speeds, and just look at all the PCI Express. And we can see that when AMD launched Threadripper with their X399 chipset, they were supported by the major Taiwanese brands of motherboards. Cooling this 180 watt processor, oh, those were the days. You can see you could use either liquid coolers or air coolers. And here we see that availability of the parts was in August of 2017 and pricing was very reasonable. You won't be shocked to learn that Intel was ready with a riposte. In late 2017 they came back with the Core i9-7980XE, which had 18 cores. However, the price was $2,000. And the reason for the enormous price jump is that this Core i9 is based on a much more expensive Xeon compared to its junior partners. It was clear that AMD had planned for this moment. With their second generation of Threadripper in 2018, we had the X series and the WX series. The X series was a pair of tweaked processors using Zen Plus architecture at 12 cores and 16 cores. The 8 core was given the kiss off. The pair of WX processors were 24 cores and 32 cores. And just look at the pricing, $1,299 for the 24 core, eclipsing the Intel 18 core, and $1,799 for 32 cores. You might wonder how AMD could cram so many processor cores inside Threadripper, and the answer is surprisingly simple. There's actually space for 4 core complexes inside a Threadripper, and the originals only had 2 plus 2 dummy cores. As you can see in this block diagram of 2950X, there's actually plenty of space, whereas the 32 core 2990WX is fully populated. Threadripper 2000 used the same Zen Plus architecture tweaks as Ryzen 2000, so AMD moved from 14nm to 12nm, and this gave a useful bump in clock speeds and also reduced core voltage. You can see this helped Threadripper 2950X take the fight to Core i9-7900X, but when it came to the 32 core 2990WX, AMD simply moved the fight beyond anything that Intel could offer in the high-end desktop platform. And we can see here AMD was continuing to use the X399 platform, and that meant these CPUs were a drop-in replacement for the original Threadrippers. To illustrate how AMD managed to cram so many cores into Threadripper and to crush Intel's high-end desktop in the process, let's just compare these two platforms. So here we have Threadripper on X399, and here we have a Core i9 high-end desktop on X299, and it's clear they are very different in size. Let's illustrate the point further. Here we have an EKU CPU block for Ryzen, and here we have a heat killer from watercool.de for Threadripper. Just look at the difference. I reviewed a 56-core Intel Sapphire Rapids for KitGuru a couple of months ago. That's a 4th gen Xeon Scalable, to give it its correct name, and this is the EK Pro block I used on that Xeon. If we compare this Pro block, which is from 2023, to the Intel high-end desktop block, you can see it dwarfs it. But if we compare this Sapphire Rapids block to the Threadripper block, you can see they're pretty much identical in size. So Threadripper started life absolutely enormous. Intel's high-end desktop started off quite small, and it's only recently that the highest of high-end desktop stuff has actually become massive in the Intel platform. The upshot is AMD had plenty of space to work with. They could put loads of cores into Threadripper without any great difficulty. It's purely a matter of cost. Late in 2019, AMD made some huge changes with Threadripper 3000. Still on Zen 2 architecture, they moved to TSMC's 7nm, so the transistors were much smaller than with previous Threadrippers. This gave loads of space for more cores. Also, they changed the name from Threadripper to Threadripper Pro, marketing this as a professional workstation product rather than high-end desktop. There were 4 models starting at 12 cores, then 16 cores, moving up to 32 cores, but the Pro 3995WX sported an enormous 64 cores and 128 threads, this with a TDP of 280 watts. Naturally, AMD compared their new Threadripper Pros with Intel Xeons, and they were able to compare the Pro 3995WX with dual Xeon Platinum 8280s. AMD now had Ryzen Threadripper that was aimed at enthusiast gamers, streamers and editors, going up to 64 cores with support for quad-channel DDR4 memory, but they also had Threadripper Pro with up to 64 cores, 8 channels of DDR4, support for up to 2 terabytes of memory and 128 lanes of PCI Express Gen 4 storage. We had to wait some time for the next generation of Threadripper, but it arrived in May of 2022 with Threadripper 5000WX. This is a Zen 3 part with up to 64 cores. You still get 128 lanes of PCI Express Gen 4, and you can see how all those Zen 3 core complexes are crowded around the 12nm I/O die in the center of the layout. The change in architecture from Zen 2 to Zen 3 is significant, but the impact on clock speed is not huge, maximum boost climbing from 4.3 GHz to 4.5 GHz. TDP remained unchanged at 280 watts, and the change in performance depended entirely on the workload. You could expect to see around 10% for most workloads, but certain specific workloads they claimed up to 50% improvement. To put this in context, the 64-core Threadripper 5000WX was now competing with Intel Xeon W3300, which topped out at 38 cores, and couldn't even run at the same speed as Threadripper. The takeaway being a clear victory for Threadripper Pro over 2 Xeon processors. This brings us up to date with the new Threadripper 7000, or more accurately, Threadripper 7000 and Threadripper Pro 7000WX. The major update for 7000 over 5000 is a move to Zen 4 architecture. However, the Pro, as I previously mentioned, goes up to 96 cores, where the regular Threadripper goes up to 64 cores. Clock speeds have climbed significantly, and we now have support for PCI Express Gen 5 rather than PCI Express Gen 4. To support these new processors, we have new platforms. TRX 50 is the high-end desktop platform, and WRX 90 is the Workstation Pro platform. You cannot install the high-end desktop Threadrippers in the Pro motherboard, but you can do it the other way around. It is possible to install a 96-core Pro processor in a regular Threadripper TRX 50 motherboard. The numbers for TRX 50 are impressive. You have support for quad-channel overclockable RDIMM memory, 88 usable lanes of PCI Express, of which 48 lanes can be Gen 5, but the numbers for WRX 90 are simply enormous. 8-channel RDIMM memory support, 144 usable lanes of PCI Express, of which 128 lanes can be Gen 5. The Threadripper 7000 processors come in 3 versions, 24, 32 and 64 cores, all with a TDP of 350 watts and clock speeds that boost beyond 5 GHz. The move to Zen 4 gives a significant IPC improvement, and when you compare the 7000WX with the 5000WX processors, the new family looks totally awesome. Off the top of our heads, we're not quite sure what you do with 128 lanes of PCI Express Gen 5. In effect, this is unlimited bandwidth and connectivity. We have no doubt that somebody's going to drop a 96-core processor in a TRX 50 motherboard, and we'd quite like to see how that performs. And here we have a couple of block diagrams showing the layout of the processor with those 12 core complexes arranged around the I/O die in the center. And now you've seen the huge changes from the first Threadripper to the present day, let's take a closer look at some of the details of the Gigabyte TRX 50 Aero D motherboard that we have on the bench. Naturally, it supports the latest 7000 processors, and it has 3 PCI Express x16 slots, along with 4 M.2 slots. Connectivity is good. You've got dual USB 4 Type-C, Wi-Fi 7 and dual Ethernet, 10 gigabit and 2.5 gigabit. The VRM is absolutely enormous, with a total of 28 phases, 16 for the V-core, 8 for the SoC and 4, humorously, for MISC. Memory support on this platform is for ECC registered RDIMMs, and you have a maximum of 1 TB of capacity. The PCB is 12 layer, which Gigabyte tells us is server grade. There are triple PCI Express x16 slots, 2 of them PCI Express Gen 5 and 1 Gen 4. On board we have 4 M.2 slots, and if you add in an Aorus Gen 5 adapter, you can add another 3 M.2 drives. There is an impressive amount of thermal armour on the board to keep it as cool as possible. And perhaps the most surprising thing of all is that the TRX 50 Aero D is listed at $599 US. To recap, the original Threadrippers came in 8, 12 and 16 core models and ran up to 4 GHz. The revised 2000 models went up to 32 cores and clocked a couple of hundred megahertz higher. Then we had Threadripper 3000 breaking new ground at up to 64 cores. Threadripper 5000 maintained the maximum core count of 64, boost speed now at 4.5 GHz, base clock speed just passing 4 GHz. Threadripper 7000 is 64 cores for high-end desktop, 96 cores for the Pro. It has support for DDR5 and PCI Express Gen 5, and it boosts beyond 5 GHz. And what does all this mean in practice? As I've already said, we don't have the 64-core Threadripper 7980X here, so I've borrowed a couple of test results from Tarinder's review over on Club 386 because I trust that chap to get it right. Let's start with Cinebench R23 Multicore. Right down the bottom of the chart with a respectable just about 17,000 points, we have the original Threadripper 1950X. Above that, at 25,000 points, we have the Threadripper 2970WX. That's got 1.5 times the core and 1.5 times the performance. Then we have the 16-core Ryzen 9 7950X, performing superbly with its high clock speed. A short distance above that, we have the Core i9 13900K at 39,000 points. And then we move on to Threadripper Pro 5000. First we have the 24 core at 41,000, and then we have the 32 core just passing the 50,000 mark. Here we can also see the Intel Xeon W9 3475X, that's Sapphire Rapids. 36 cores running at a mere 3 GHz but scoring 50,830. After that we have the Threadripper 3990X, 64 cores running at 3.1 GHz and a score of 63,000. A fraction above that we have the 32 core Threadripper 7970X scoring 64,000. The combination of 32 cores at 4.55 GHz is really impressive. At 72,000 points we have the 56 core Xeon W9 3495X, and then we come to the 64 core Threadripper Pro 5995WX scoring 72,320. Clear at the top of the chart we have the Threadripper 7980X figure that we borrowed from Club 386, just under 100,000 points. And then we move on to power consumption. How much did those processors pull while they were running Cinebench? It's an enormous spread. At a mere 179 watts we have the Threadripper 1950X. Slightly above that we have the Ryzen 9 7950X passing 200 watts. The real standouts are those Intel Xeons. The 36 core at 375 watts. The 56 core at 485 watts. As we can see in the middle of the chart, a number of those Threadrippers are pulling 285 watts and the new 7000 series 350 watts. It's no great surprise on Cinebench R23 single core that the desktop processors are at the top of the charts. After all, they run at very high clock speeds. It is interesting to see that right behind those we have the new Threadripper 7000s. That Zen 4 architecture really helps. Behind those we have the Sapphire Rapids Intels, and then we drop down through the older Threadrippers. Essentially newer parts, run faster and score better. And let's have a look at Crystal Disk Mark 8 to see what the changes to PCI Express have on SSD speed. At the bottom of the chart, the Threadripper 1950X with the WD Black SN50. This is a Gen 4 SSD, but it can't run at Gen 4 speeds on this platform, so the transfer speeds are around 3.5 GB per second. Stepping up to the Threadripper 2970WX with the WD Black, again we have a PCI Express 3 platform and the Gen 4 drive cannot perform to its true potential. so the speeds are unchanged. Things get interesting when we move up to the Threadripper 3990X, where the WD Black is able to perform correctly. Read speed is 7 GB per second, and the write is better than 5 GB per second. On the same Threadripper 3990X, we also installed a Crucial T700 Pro. This is a Gen 5 SSD, and it did in fact perform better than the Gen 4 SSD, even though the platform doesn't support Gen 5. The read speed is 7.1 GB per second, and the write 6.8 GB per second. With the Threadripper 7970X, this is a Gen 5 platform. We first installed the Kingston Fury Renegade, which is a Gen 4 drive. The read speed's just about 7.4 GB per second, and the write had passed 7 GB per second. And then we installed the Crucial T700 Pro, which is a Gen 5 drive on this Gen 5 platform, and the numbers are huge. Read 11.7 GB per second, write 9.4 GB per second. And we also checked out memory performance using AIDA64. This is clearly a combination of the platform and the memory. At the bottom of the chart we have the Threadripper 2970WX. Threadripper 2000 is complicated because the layout of the core complexes affects how it treats near and far memory. So the DDR4 3600 not performing all that well. Second from the bottom we have the Threadripper 1950X. Here the DDR4 can perform as we'd expect and the figures are perfectly decent. Then we step up to the Threadripper 3990X and some perfectly reasonable performance. Above that we have Core i9-13900K with fast DDR5, and then we move up to some serious numbers. Sapphire Rapid Xeon with DDR5 6000 ECC quad channel memory has good performance. Threadripper Pro 5000 with DDR4 3200 but 8 channel has very strong performance. Second from the top we have our Threadripper 7970X with DDR5 RDIMM 5600 memory. This is quad channel and the performance is good. At the top of the chart we have Club 386's Threadripper with DDR5 RDIMM 6400, and that delivers huge performance. I didn't expect this video to go on for quite so long, but the more I looked at Threadripper, the more I found. And more to the point, the more I found that was impressive. These new Zen 4 Threadripper 7000s, they're really impressive. And I can hardly wait for Scan to deliver that test system in the new year. And so I say, roll on 2024.